Hi there and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome the Towson University community, our Baltimore collaborators, and those of you who are able to join us from around the country and beyond. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. My name is Matthew Durrington, and I'm a professor of anthropology, and I'm proud to serve as the director for community engagement and partnerships at Towson University. Before we begin, I'd like to thank President Kim Schatzel for her support of this event. I'd also like to thank Dr. Leah Cox, Brian Hara, and Bobby Lauer for their support. And I would especially like to thank the entire team working behind the scenes, including Mikey Mullen, who's steering the ship for us today. This event is co-sponsored by BTU and OIIE at TU. Let me unpack those acronyms for you. BTU stands for Baltimore plus Towson University, and is one of 8 presidential priorities of our president, Dr. Kim Schatzel. Towson University is committed to positive impacts, making a difference and transforming lives in greater Baltimore and throughout Maryland. But we don't do this work alone. We do it through community engagement. At TU, community engagement is supported by BTU, elevating the work we're already doing with partners throughout greater Baltimore to better address the needs of the region. The Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity at Towson University strives to foster a culture of integrity that values shared responsibility as a critical element of an inclusive, equitable, and diverse community at TU. OIIE works to support the university's commitment to a learning and working environment free from sexual misconduct, discrimination, harassment, hate, and bias. OIIE includes accessibility and disability services, the Center for Student Diversity, Title IX hate crimes and bias incidents response, and diversity inclusion initiatives. Led by OIIE, Towson University recently announced its inaugural diversity strategic plan. This plan emerged out of a number of critical conversations and represents the commitment of Towson University to address diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campus and in our community engagement work. Our goal today is to utilize the expertise of Dr. Lawrence Brown to focus our attention on how we can take lessons in the book, The Black Butterfly, and use them for our praxis, and take this knowledge as an ethos for the toolkit we use in community engagement work in the Baltimore region and beyond. Some of you may have recently seen the Sesame Street 50-year anniversary show that aired on ABC last week. I love Sesame Street because they have found a way to have difficult conversation that adults often find difficult to have. One of the creative directors for Sesame Street on the show stated that they do not react, they respond. We should all ask ourselves how we can respond both as individuals and as an institution. We have pushed for diversity and increasingly worked toward that goal. We have created spaces for dialogue about equity, but what does that mean on multiple levels? We know inclusion is a goal, but as a colleague told me over the weekend about her frustration with just being included because she wants transformation. We transform by recognizing our past, our present, and setting a course for the future at Towson University where our work is for the public good. So how do we implement that? And what principles should we follow? In the landmark book, The Black Butterfly, Dr. Lawrence Brown provides a number of grounding principles that he will discuss today, as well as plans of action. On page 5 of the introduction to that book, Dr. Brown outlines 5 principles. To implement a robust racial equity strategy, government officials, philanthropies, corporations, and nonprofits must follow these 5 steps. 1, obtain a deep understanding of historical trauma inflicted on Black neighborhoods. 2, identify and stop all forms of ongoing historical trauma affecting Black neighborhoods. 3, make decision-making participatory and deeply democratic for existing residents in red-line communities. 4, ensure a meaningful community ownership and wealth-generating stake in all projects, programs, developments, and interventions using collective economics. And 5, make corrective and equitable budget allocations and funding choices to repair the damage caused by ongoing historical trauma on redline neighborhoods. We have made a PDF for all of you with these 5 principles at a link in the comments section of the YouTube channel. I hope you will download it, print it, tack it up on a wall, share it on social media with attribution to @BeMoreDoc, BMoreDoc, @BeMoreDoc, and keep it in mind when you volunteer, engage, research, participate, dialogue, and collaborate. I truly believe the Black Butterfly is a roadmap for our country to work for racial equity and structural change, and it is centered in Baltimore. Our speaker today is Dr. Lawrence T. Brown. He's an equity scientist and the director at the Black Butterfly Academy, a virtual racial equity education and consulting firm. From 2013 to 2019, he served as an assistant and associate professor at Morgan State University in the School of Community Health and Policy, where he launched the hashtag Be More Lead Free initiative. In June 2018, he was honored by OSI Baltimore with the Bold Thinker Award for sparking critical discourse regarding Baltimore's racial segregation. In 2020, he directed the U.S. COVID-19 Atlas work in response for the County Health Rankings and Roadmaps program, in partnership with the University of Chicago Center for Spatial Data Science. His first book, The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in January 2021. Uncomfortable conversations are the ones that we should welcome. They are the conversations we need to have. I'm so thankful that we have created a space today for that, and I'm thankful to have Dr. Lawrence Brown with us. If you'd like to submit a question, you can do so through the chat function on YouTube. If you're viewing this on the Towson University site, you can click Watch on YouTube or the YT logo to find the chat feature. We did have some questions beforehand, and we'll be going through those as well. So last but not least, I do want to note that I only have one fundamental disagreement with Dr. Brown, and that would be ranking our favorite Star Wars movies. As you know, today is May the 4th. Dr. Brown ranks Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and Rogue One as 1, 2, 3. I, of course, always go with A New Hope, Rogue One, and Empire Strikes Back. Now, 2 of those 3 are the same between us, which means we can come to consensus, and may the 4th be with you all. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Lawrence Brown.
All right. Good afternoon to everyone joining us from the East Coast, and good morning if you're joining us from somewhere else in the continental or otherwise somewhere else in the United States. I'm really excited to talk to you today about what real community engagement can and should look like, particularly for university and specifically Towson University, and the way that universities engage with communities really has a lot to do with the history. Some people call it the town gown engagement, but the way in which the city and the municipality and the metropolitan area have been laid out, it plays a key role in how we think about community engagement with universities today. So I want to jump into and start with some key definitions, because that's what we're going to need as we embark on this journey. And as we pull those up, I just also want to thank Matthew for the invitation. Thank you, Towson, for allowing me to share some ideas with you. And I'm looking forward to the 4th being with us. And so let's start with this definition, ongoing historical trauma. And so this is a term that was developed by a Native American scholar named Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. And it was really discussed in this paper that you see on the screen. It was by a scholar named Michelle Sotero. And I encourage everyone to pull this article down because it is truly a landmark article. And she talks about the way that historical trauma is intergenerational. It's not just something that impacts the first generation to experience a mass trauma experience. Now, what do we mean when we talk about a mass trauma experience? If we can go back to that slide. What we mean when we say a mass trauma experience, we're talking about really things like war, imperialism, colonization, apartheid, enslavement, caste systems. So this is something that applies globally depending on the local context, the local history. Whenever a vulnerable group of people experience mass trauma like war, imperialism, colonization, somebody taking their land, enslavement, enslaving people, caste system imposing hierarchy in a society, apartheid, physically separating people. Whenever you have that happen in a society, that is a mass trauma experience. And that will impose or inflict a certain amount of damage, not only on the first generation to experience it, but also the generations to come. So this is what makes it an intergenerational model that we're talking about. And so the way that I talk about it in my book is with this definition that you see, the intergenerational effects of mass traumas that I just got through describing, combined with contemporary structural violence. So this is not just about what's happening in the past, it's about what is still going on. so that it continues to inflict damage. And before I move to that slide, I want to really hone in on this. So I want to tell you about the damage that's in this model. She says, Ms. Sotero, in this paper right here, a conceptual model of historical trauma, implications for public health practice and research. Dr. Sotero says that there are really four main elements of that damage when we talk about historical trauma. So number one, we're talking about segregation / forced displacement. That's number one. Number two, second form of damage is economic destruction. Number three, physical / psychological violence. And then number four is cultural dispossession, taking somebody's way of life, forcing them to change their religion, their way of living, their way of dressing, their way of eating. So these are four different forms of damage that a group can have, a vulnerable group can have when it's imposed or when historical trauma is inflicted on that population. And so it's not only damages the people, but it can damage the places and spaces where they live. So we're talking about spatial inequality, spatial inequity. And the way that this damage is ongoing is transmitted through policies, practices, systems, and budgets. I used to have my students repeat that after me in class all the time. Policies, practices, systems, and budgets. That is how ongoing historical trauma is transmitted intergenerationally in the contemporary through communities. So let us start with that key definition. So next I want to talk about equity. What do we mean when we say equity? A lot of people are using the word equity today, and quite often I don't believe they're doing so in a very accurate way. Now, part of that is because equity is used in a variety of ways. It's also a financial term. But as a social term, when we think about what happens in a society, equity means doing more for those communities that have less wealth and health due to what we just got through discussing, ongoing historical trauma. If people have been colonized, if they've been placed into a caste system at the bottom, if they've been enslaved, if they've been conquered in terms of imperialism, then you would have to do more for those groups of people to bring them to a level of parity and equality in a society. So notice the first word in that definition, doing. Doing is the first word. And that is an important thing that I want to highlight, because we can have, even what we're doing right now, having a conversation. People have equity discussions. They bring in equity speakers like me. People talk about an equity lens, an equity perspective. None of that is equity. It may be a precursor, it may be a prelude, but if you're not doing more, again, through policies, practices, systems, and budgets, then that's not equity. Equity is action. Concrete action is what we do, not what we say. So that is, I believe, what Matthew's colleague was saying earlier, transformation. We don't want people just coming up with the most beautiful. And let me tell you, I have seen some of the most beautiful diversity, equity, and inclusion statements ever. They are just flowery, beautiful, opulent statements that just warm your heart. But then you get up in some of these universities and environments, and they are rabidly harmful, damaging, impacting people in a negative way. Because people is not just what we say, equity is what we do. So equity is a process of repairing damage and making communities whole. So if that's not happening, then you may have something else going on, but it's not equity. It is not equity until you do what needs to be done to restore those communities that have been damaged due to ongoing historical trauma. So now what does that look like in terms of racial equity? So the next definition that we want to really take a look at is in a racial context, particularly with African Americans in the United States. What we're talking about is taking restorative actions. again, the damage that was done. African Americans are one of the populations globally that was enslaved. And so what we're saying is, and Black neighborhoods, geographic neighborhoods, were red lined while white communities were green lined and blue lined. We'll talk about that later. I'm going to show you that map to really highlight what I'm talking about. So taking restorative actions to help red line Black communities organize themselves. So this is what we're taking action so that communities themselves can be empowered to heal from ongoing historical trauma. Again, what are those 4 elements of historical trauma? Segregation, forced displacement, physical slash psychological violence, economic destruction, cultural dispossession. These are all elements of historical trauma that communities need the ability to heal from. If we're talking about Native Americans, they would need the ability to heal from segregation, being uprooted, the Trail of Tears, being placed on reservations, their loss of culture and the dispossession of their way of life, economic destruction, the destruction of their economies, and also physical and psychological violence, placing their children in boarding schools. So this is, again, something that is a global construct, but if we're looking at it in the African-American context, and Baltimore City as itself is a majority African-American city, and this metropolitan area has a high percentage of African-Americans, Latinos, Latinas, and others, Native Americans, small Lumbee tribe in Upper Fells Point. So this is a diverse area. It has a lot of people of color. So different communities often have histories that will need to be addressed. And so this is what we're talking about, taking, there's that verb again, taking restorative actions. That is racial equity. So if somebody's talking about racial equity and you ask them, well, what are you doing? Well, we talking about it. That is not racial equity. Racial equity is what we do, taking restorative actions. Now you're talking about racial equity. This requires fully acknowledging and then stopping. See, some of the stuff is still going on. Redlining, subpriming, marginalizing, demonizing, police violence, mass incarceration. Some things are still going on. So part of what racial equity entails is stopping the mess and the manifestations of ongoing historical trauma. That's a part of the work. So not just starting new stuff, but stopping the old stuff, stopping the mess, stopping the way in which we are hurting and harming communities. We got to have to take an inventory. Racial equity, in effect, involves a reckoning, taking account of what is happening so that you can figure out what do we need to keep going, what do we need to start new, and what do we need to discontinue in order to move communities forward. So this is something that we want to be very, very clear about. The next thing I want to talk about is the term, this definition. We got to be clear on this as well. Segronomics. Segronomics, powerful term developed by a scholar named Noliwe Rooks in her book, Cutting School, that you see there. And she defines it as the business of profiting specifically from high levels of racial and economic segregation. So that's how she's defining in her book. I like her term so much because she's using it in the realm of education. I said, well, segronomics is happening all throughout society. So in my book, I took the liberty and gave a friendly amendment to her definition and said that segronomics is the economic weaponization of racial segregation. So if anybody's taking notes, you can write that down, go home, tell your mama, tell your friends that Dr. Brown said segronomics is the economic weaponization. That's what I talked about earlier, redlining, subpriming, check cashing facilities, pawn shops, making auto insurance cost more in red line Black neighborhoods. So penalizing people economically in a racially segregated environment. That is segronomics. And that is a key feature of our society that is happening today. So the last definition I want us to be clear about, a lot of people talk about white flight. And Towson's in a suburban, it's right outside of Baltimore City. So white flight is what a lot of people use when they think about, how Baltimore County became the population juggernaut that it is today, especially starting in the 1950s. Many white Baltimoreans fled the city. At one point, back in 1950, Baltimore had a population around 950,000 people. Almost 1 million people lived in Baltimore. Today, it's about 605,000. So Baltimore has lost from its peak about 1/3 of its once high population. And of that 950,000, 700,000 or so were white. Today, about 400,000 African Americans live in Baltimore. 400,000. Baltimore could have never become a majority Black city unless there was white Baltimoreans leaving the city in order to move to the county. Today, there are about 200,000 white Baltimoreans, which means there was an out migration of nearly 500,000 white Baltimoreans. 500,000 left the city. So the term that I think we have to be very clear on is, are we talking about white flight? And I say it's not just that. It's white desegregation resistance and flight. So white flight is not just a merely neutral phenomenon. We're talking about desegregation resistance. There was that Supreme Court decision that I'm sure we're all familiar with, Brown versus Board of Education, handed down in June or late May of 1954. And when African American children were allowed to attend schools with white children, many white families fled the city to oppose desegregation. They did not want to send their children to school with Black children. So this is what we're talking about, white desegregation resistance. And that's a part of the legacy of a school like Towson, of a place, a city like Towson. It's part of the legacy of Baltimore County. So let us keep that in mind as well. Part of Baltimore County's history I also want to lift up is that there have been Black communities and enclaves in the city. As you'll see on the next slide, or in the county, there are Black cities, enclaves that have been uprooted and displaced. So these are Black communities that did exist, but they've been either diminished or severely, or in some ways actually wiped out, destroyed through a variety of mechanisms that you see here. Sometimes Black communities had highways built right in the middle of them. And that meant people had to get up, people had to go, they were displaced. We also see a couple of communities, they were uprooted, displaced by industrial zoning. You see two of those there. And then East Towson, where you are, commercial zoning is one of the culprits. Remember, one of the harms of ongoing historical trauma is segregation / forced displacement. So one component of historical trauma is when people are forced to leave their home, their land, and this has happened, as you can see, several times in the history of Baltimore County. So let me show you a couple of maps that really get at that term segronomics, because we've lifted up displacement. So I want to talk about segronomics and maybe make sure we flesh that out. You can see at the top of this map, at the time, Towson was not, university was called the Maryland State Teachers College when this map was created, which was in 1937. So this map was created by the federal government. The federal government, an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation later became the Federal Housing Administration. So this is a agency, federal agency, was founded during the response to the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, federal government's getting involved in lending, financing of home buyings because of the crash of the stock market. Many savings and loans and banking institutions had gone under. So now the federal government is taking a powerful role in the lending for home buying. And look at what we have here. 4 colors on the map. Many people are familiar with redlining, from which that term derives, but there are 4 colors on the map: red, yellow, blue, and green. Now this map is one of the most powerful maps in American history because it dictated which communities were able to receive access to capital, access to loans for homes and for small businesses. So those red communities would be starved of capital, while the green and blue communities, oh, the bankers just love to see them coming because they would just endow them and bless them and give them all kinds of lending with low interest rates, which meant they could own a home, which meant they could gain wealth, which meant they could have small businesses, which meant they could gain and boost employment in their community. So, and if you read Intero Patello's book, Not in My Neighborhood, he has a great chapter in there, chapter 5, called Mapping Bigotry. And he talks about how that pseudoscience, fake science, pseudoscience of eugenics was used to underpin the logic and thinking behind this map. You can also read more about this in the great book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. So what you'll see on the next slide is the legend. We'll zoom into that bottom left corner. You see the technical name of this map was the Residential Security Map. Residential security from what? Residential security from who? Because remember, as I said, this was a map drawn by the federal government with the assistance of state and local officials. So everybody had a role. Government had a role to play in determining which neighborhoods received money, capital from banks for home lending, for small businesses, red, blue, yellow, and green. It was based, these colors were based on the racial composition of the people who lived in these communities. So green was white Anglo-Saxon. Blue was also white Anglo-Saxon, but oftentimes Jewish populations were barred. They could not live in those green communities, so they were often in the blue communities. In yellow, you often have the European immigrant populations who had come over previously from places like Italy, Ireland, Russia, Poland. They were trying to get out of Europe because Europe was a violent place. World War I had already broke loose. So we got to go. We got to get to a land of opportunity, a land of peace, because Europe is just going to hell in a handbasket. So we getting out of here. So they came to America. And when they came to America, many of those immigrants, because they weren't American yet, they were still speaking their indigenous language. They're still speaking Russian and Italian and Polish, and they weren't quite American. So they were often in those yellow communities. And then in the red, urban Native Americans and African Americans. And these are the communities that would often be deprived of capital, of funding, of resources that would allow them to thrive. And we can see in these last two slides, the impact is of this map is still with us. Well, actually, I forgot about this slide right here. So before I get to the last two slides, look at public housing. Let us see where public housing was placed. Each green or maroon dot, it tells you where public housing communities. Back then they were called, well, officially you can see public housing projects. There was double racial segregation taking place with public housing. Number one, the first form of racial segregation we see is that public housing communities were racially segregated. You had Black public housing, or back then, Black people were called Negro or colored. So you had Negro public housing, and you see those in the green. And then you had white public housing, and you see those in the maroonish red. So the public housing communities themselves were racially segregated. But I told you there was double racial segregation. So the other form of racial segregation that took place is where public housing was located. Do you see, actually, if you see on the bottom left, the darker the gray for the census tract, the more African Americans lived in that community. So look at where public housing was placed. We don't see public housing placed in the north central part of the city, Mount Washington, Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, anywhere near Towson. No public housing was placed there. Why? Because it was placed intentionally in red line black communities. Public housing was placed in the places where African Americans live. It was not spatially distributed in an equitable way. So you see it in and around places, communities where African Americans live. And then also you see it around the water, the waterfront. You see for public housing, Cherry Hill, Brooklyn, that area of the city, Westport, public housing is placed there as well. And this is during World War II. So this is when industrial pollution, shipbuilding, the war effort was at its peak. You did not want to live near the water at that time. It was too much pollution. And so that is where public housing was placed, in environmentally oppressed communities, or communities that would experience extreme amounts of pollution and environmental exposure, toxic environmental exposures. So double racial segregation is what we're talking about. The placement of, so there's this term, concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty. And I know a lot of you have heard it. I hate the term concentrated poverty, because what that, you can pull this off for 1 second. I want to talk directly to the people, I want to have a quick conversation real quick. Concentrated poverty is a misleading, misnomer, fake term, because what I just showed you is a history of how poverty was concentrated. That's what that term doesn't really explain. Concentrated poverty doesn't tell us how poverty became concentrated. It's not as though poor people just randomly decide to go be poor together. All right, y'all, we poor. Where are we going to be poor at? I don't know. Let's go randomly be poor over here or over there. That's not what happened. We saw that the federal government, along with local housing authorities like the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, intentionally placed public housing for lower income people in the communities that were already redlined, that had a high percentage of African Americans. So poverty people didn't just randomly get together. Poverty was clustered intentionally. And this is what, when you hear that phrase, make sure you critique it. Who concentrated the poverty? How did poverty get concentrated? It wasn't random. Policies, practices, systems, and budgets. So the last two slides I want to show you, thank you for letting me just talk to the people for a few seconds. The last two slides that I want to show you then, well, after this, I keep thinking it's the last two. We're almost there. So this slide basically shows you Baltimore metropolitan area today. Baltimore metropolitan area is a hyper segregated metropolitan community, or metropolitan area overall. This is a racial dot map created by Dustin Cable, who's at the University of Virginia, where green dots represent African Americans, blue dots represent white Americans, red dots represent Asian Americans, orange dots represent Latino, Latina, Latinx community, and then brown represents other race and also Native American. Like I said, there's a small Lumbee community in Upper Fells Point. About 4,000 or so folks from the Lumbee community live there, and that's near the water. So you see this pattern, the white L coming down the center of the city and then banking east at the harbor. The white L, the black butterfly, you see where the green dots are spread out like the wings of a butterfly. And then you have the Asian archipelago and the Latino lagoon right around Patterson Park. If you look at Towson, where Towson is, look at all those blue dots and look at the lack of green dots. This is a function of racial segregation and a function of those policies that I mentioned earlier. This is Baltimore today, the Baltimore metropolitan area. And so Towson exists in a hyper-segregated category 5, like a hurricane. The most intense form of a hurricane that we know, think of that as an analogy for segregation. Baltimore metropolitan area is a category 5 hyper-segregated area. And so the impact of those things, as I finish up now, the impact of that is shown on the what I believe are the final two slides. And well, no, still have another one. All right, so this actually shows from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition where bank lending is taking place about a decade ago. So 2011 to 2013, the bigger the dot, the more the loans. So on the left, that is a map for home mortgage lending. And on the right, that's a map for small business lending. Look at where the loans are going. By and large, those green areas, again, that's where African Americans live. Most of the lending for homes today are in that white L along the harbor. And then also the bigger the dots, bigger dots are in those for small business lending. You see bigger dots also in the L as well. And you see in the suburban area, like where Towson is, a healthy amount of lending taking place there. Healthy amount of lending so lots of capital is flowing into racially white communities today, demographically white communities. So we see that redlining is not just a thing of the past. Redlining is still going on. And that's why there's the term I use in my book, ongoing historical trauma, not just way back when. We see that it is happening right now. So on the next slide, which I finally believe, yes, all right, now we are coming down the home stretch. So this analysis by Zillow, the home analysis, mortgage analysis company, they looked at home values for those four colors that we talked about earlier. What are the values of the homes in those four color coded communities today? And what we see on the next slide is that today, the homes that were colored red or in the red colored communities back in 1937, look at where their home values are today, still at the bottom. Homes in red line communities have lower values. If you look between 1997 and 2017, lower home values. And not only that, look at the gap. In 1997, there's about a $50,000 gap between the bottom and the top. Look at how the gap is getting bigger. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And we all know that the value of people's homes is a big part of what people use to determine their wealth in America. So if you don't have high home values, that's impacting how much wealth you have, how much loans or how much you can use as collateral to get a loan and maybe help fix up the house, or maybe help get rid of lead that's in the house, or help start a small business, or send a child to college. When you cannot get capital, when your value of the wealth value of your property is depressed by living in a red community, that is impacting your economic, financial prospects for yourself, your family, and your community. So I'm going to stop right there. I know Matthew has like 8,000 or 9,000 questions he wants to share with me, but we're probably going to just cover about 4 or 5 of those as we move forward.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that great context. So when folks registered for the talk, they were given the opportunity to submit a question. And in addition to those questions, we've received several during the talk today that I've been reviewing and I'll add to the mix. But after reviewing questions previously submitted, there was one question submitted that Dr. Brown wanted to address directly and prepare for. And then I will proceed through the rest in the time we have left today. But that first question was, what is the prospect of reducing fatherlessness in the Black community with mayors uninterested in addressing that problem?
All right. So I thought this was a very, very interesting question. I wanted to make sure we unpack it, because this person who's asking this question is asking about the trope, the myth of Black fatherlessness. And so I want to make sure that we address this. And if you look at, there's data that comes from, that I placed on a slide that I wanted everyone to see. There's data here from the National Center for Health Statistics. And if we zoom in on that so everybody can see it on their computer, there you go. What you'll see is that sort of the orange, darker orange, brownish line represents Black fathers, dark gray represents white fathers, light gray represents Latino fathers. And so what you see is that when you look at different categories, according to the data that they produce from this survey report, what you see is that African-American Black fathers actually, if you were looking at children under 5, they fed or ate meals with their children daily at a higher rate than other fathers. They bathed, diapered, or dressed children daily at a higher rate than other fathers. They played with children daily on par with white fathers, just slightly below there. If you're looking at fathers living with kids, but in terms of fathers not living with kids, African-American fathers do play with their children daily at a higher percentage, read to their children daily. African-Americans more engaged. Children over the age of 5, you see 8 meals with children daily, not at the bottom of that particular category. But if you look at took children to and from daily activities, African-American fathers more engaged. If we look at talk to children about their day daily, African-American fathers more engaged. Help children with homework or check it that they finished it daily, African-American fathers more engaged. So the data reveals to us that the trope of Black fatherlessness is false, that this idea that Black fathers are not involved in the lives of their children, according to the National Center for Health Statistics, this is false. Now, the other part of that question said, well, you know, the mayor's not interested. Well, actually, there is an African-American male engagement office in Baltimore City, and it's a part of the division of the mayor's office of children and family success. So we can debunk both of the sneaky assumptions that are behind that question with data and the existence. Mayors obviously do care about male engagement, African-American male engagement in the communities and the lives of the children and families. And then last but not least, everything that I just got through talking about. Racial equity, stopping and undoing redlining, subpriming, marginalizing, demonizing, understanding this history. This all helps Black fathers. This all helps Black families. If we do racial equity, not talk about it, do racial equity in the right way, which means that we help heal communities that have been damaged by ongoing historical trauma. So that's the way that I think we need to think about that question.
Great. Thank you for that clarification, that context, because as you know, Dr. Brown, those tropes of Black fatherlessness and the single female-headed household and what's usually symbolically attached to it often fall into those racialized tropes. So I'm really, really glad that you took that as the first question.
Absolutely. The other side of that is that what we know about racial stereotypes and tropes is that they're used often as the basis for policies.
Right. Policies
that are often very destructive to Black families. So that's why we have to be very clear, have the data, and understand facts so that we understand that history is really what's at the root, but that African-American fathers are actually more engaged than other fathers. So maybe we need something for all fathers. Maybe we need a white fatherhood initiative. We need a Latino fatherhood initiative. Maybe we need an initiative for all the fathers, because apparently we know that the fathers of other races also have issues as well. So we want to help all the families, but I think that trope about Black fathers not being engaged, we see as a false one.
Agreed. One of the other questions that came up in the comments during your talk was about that category 5 metaphor that you used. And I think that's one of the strongest parts of the book, because you're constantly using different metaphors for what happens when all these structural and everyday practices are bundled together. So the person who wrote it asked, could you mention the other cities that are category 5 along those same lines?
Yes, it's a very great question. You know, there are 8 category 5 hyper-segregated metropolitan areas or cities. There are 8 of those cities. We know Baltimore is one of them. So it's Baltimore, and we recognize the other cities. You should recognize them right off the top: Baltimore, Chicago, Flint, Detroit, Birmingham, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. And Milwaukee is statistically, if you look at the 5 measures that are used to calculate hypersegregation, Milwaukee has the highest statistical average out of those 8 cities. What's interesting is that if you look at 2017 homicide data, homicide rates per capita, those hypersegregated cities show up. St. Louis, number 1 in homicides per capita. Number 2, Baltimore. Number 3, Memphis, which is not a category 5 city, but then Chicago, number 4, Detroit, number 5. So what you see is that homicides per capita, violence, crime, a lot of that is driven, we see, by being in a hyper-segregated city. Now, I want to be very, very clear. What does hyper-segregation mean? That's why I started with key definitions, because it's good to have a clear basis of what you're talking about. So what does hyper-segregation do? As I mentioned earlier, segronomics. Segronomics is the economic weaponization of racial segregation. So if you have a hyper-segregated city like Baltimore, what you in effect have is the hyper allocation of resources to white communities, like those loans that I showed you earlier, the bank lending. And you have at the same time the hyper deprivation of capital and resources in Black neighborhoods. And this is happening at the same time in a category 5, especially in a category 5 hyper segregated city. The hyper allocation of resources to white communities and the hyper deprivation of resources to Black communities. And again, policies, practices, systems, and budgets. That is how ongoing historical trauma is transmitted. And that's what we're going to have to sever. That's what we're going to have to address. And that is the damage of hyper-segregation, is flooding white communities with resources and starving Black neighborhoods of resources.
Thank you for that context too. And I think with those category 5 cities and Baltimore specifically, another great attribute of your book, just along with the color of law and the increased awareness of redlining practices, covenants, and what have you, is that it doesn't take much to walk around Baltimore City and see how this is inscribed in the cartography and the geography of the city, just looking at Utah Street and Marble Hill versus Bolton Hill. And some of the other correlates to what you're talking about in terms of equity, segronomics, home ownership, what have you, are also health indicators. And I will selfishly admit that this is my question. In your Twitter feed, which if you're not following at BeMoreDoc, you should be, because there's great dialogue throughout the day. The last few months, you've talked about a number of issues, but one of the things that's been really fascinating to me was your labeling of certain rollouts and the inaccessibility of vaccines to certain populations as a kind of vaccine apartheid. And I was wondering if you can maybe unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. Well, apartheid, I want to sort of start backing up by saying there's a scholarly history or scholarly legacy of using that term. So Douglas Massey, a sociologist at Princeton, his colleague Nancy Denton, they co-wrote a book called American Apartheid in the 90s. And they're talking about racial segregation in that book and the impacts of it. You have scholars like Professor Emeritus Garrett Power at the University of Maryland. He writes about a paper called Apartheid Baltimore Style. And he talks about the initial zoning ordinance, racist zoning ordinance that starts in Baltimore, December 19th, 1910, under then Mayor John Barry Mahul. And so he unpacks that history, he lays it out. And so he's also using this term apartheid. So apartheid is not just this South African phenomenon, it's an American phenomenon. It's the separating of people by race, which is what has happened in America, formerly known to most people here in America as Jim Crow, although the scholar Kay Whitehead at Loyola calls it Jim and Jane Crow. Mm-hmm. So apartheid is separating people by space. And so given that that's already America's spatial legacy, that's already American history, if you have a new effort like vaccines or anything that comes, there's transit, some, the building of bike lanes, the establishment of protected bike lanes and biking infrastructure, which really kicked off in the last decade in Baltimore. Whenever you have these new efforts, they map right onto the existing apartheid that's already in place. And so vaccines, then, what we saw is that as the pandemic, as the vaccines began to be rolled out, access to vaccines were in the communities, the demographically whiter communities that already had access to resources. And so there's this language around vaccine hesitancy. And I went and I looked at the World Health Organization definition of it, because they pioneered the term, and they said, well, really, you don't even think about if people themselves are hesitant until access has been broadly granted, until communication and administration is really taken care of. So people don't have to worry about any of those things. Then once you take care of that, then you can talk about whether or not people are hesitating. But what we saw is that people were using the term hesitancy and they weren't addressing the structural factor. You may recall there were instances in the news where there were people coming, even when vaccines were brought to Black and brown communities, you had wealthier, whiter communities coming into those Black communities to snatch those vaccines and get vaccinated for themselves. So, I mean, this is you saw that on CNN and other news outlets. So I think that's the thing. When we're talking about apartheid, we're talking about vaccines that were not initially located in the communities that were hit hardest. And then when they were administered in a problematic way. So you had website registration. The sign up was online. Everybody don't have a computer. Everybody don't have good Wi-Fi. Everybody don't have good internet on their phone. And a lot of people who are older in African-American communities, they more so rely on verbal communication, maybe a phone call. So even the way that it was set up was not inclusive for Black communities. So the people who could get online really quick because they're working from home, they're not really out and about. They working from home. They can just log on. I'm going to go to the Bronx. I'm going to go to South Central LA, and I'm going to go get that vaccine. So that's what I talked about when I said vaccine apartheid, is really the mapping of this new administration of resources right on top of the existing apartheid that already exists, and the way that public health officials and government officials, they weren't thinking through how that legacy was going to impact this new administration of vaccines.
Yeah, thanks for providing that context. I find that, I think there are some mitigation efforts starting to happen in terms of going into church settings and other things too, where rapport exists and trust exists, and we start to see that. So I hope that will continue to be mitigated. But interestingly enough, when you were talking about infrastructure as well, I could tell that a lot of Baltimore locals here in the comments too, but even talking about, and for those of you outside of Baltimore, I apologize for the highways, and you could look at it on a map later, but even the way that I-83 jags up and then moves over a little bit, and how that was a consequence of folks saying that they didn't want a highway displacement there. I've done research on highway displacement in Sharp, Leadenhall, and in other communities too. And what Frank Butler was talking about as well, and I find it ironic, but not ironic, that it was going to be the red line that went through Baltimore, and then all of a sudden it wasn't going to be there. But that need for subway lines, for more infrastructure, for things that address climate change, that's been one of the ironies as well, is when we have possibilities for infrastructure to start to remedy some of these solutions, they tend to fall by the wayside because they're not politically expedient or something that some folks in the legislature may want to get behind or not.
Absolutely. And I think, I want to mention, what does all this have to do with universities? The thing I want to really highlight is that you have universities in a Category 5 hypersegregated metropolitan area like Baltimore, the Baltimore region. So any university, or Towson especially, you really have to understand this history. you have to understand that when you're approaching and trying to do community engagement with communities that have been harmed, hurt, damaged over and over, they've been disrespected, they've been underserved, and you're trying to engage those communities, people have that history in the back of their minds. People understand, sometimes not even consciously, but they understand, okay, I'm not so sure about this institution that says they want to help, because what help has looked like for many African-American communities is urban renewal.
Yeah.
James Baldwin, the Black writer, called Negro removal. That's been phrased as help. Highways being built through Black communities. And this happened all over the nation. I-10 running east-west down in the southern states. I-95 running up the East Coast through Miami. I-10 through Birmingham, through Black Miami. Highways being built through Black communities. These highways are going to help. So when people talk about, well, we're coming to do community engagement and we want to help the community is like, whoa. Some of this help y'all been giving us has been very disruptive and very destructive. Mm-hmm. So people question that based on this history. And so if you're a university and you're not aware of this history, if you're not understanding what is the role of, what is Towson's history? Mm-hmm. What is Towson's history with East Towson? What is Towson's history with the campus expansion? Whose land, was anybody's land taken? Was anybody hurt in the process of past expansions? I don't know. I'm not that deeply versed in Towson history, but that is what you must be in the university. You must be well versed in your history, and that's where the first point of the racial equity process really starts, is having a deep understanding of history. A lot of people want to run out solutions. We want to get to solutions. No. Don't start with solutions. If you don't understand the problem, don't go talking about solutions.
Right.
Sit down, study, read, research, reflect what has happened, so that when you do community engagement, you have a good sense of what's really going on.
Yeah, having that historical context to inform the contemporary. Otherwise, what do? You got to establish. And I also said too, long term, rapport building. Don't fly in, do a survey, and fly out. You got to be in there. You got to be in the church basements. You got to be in the meetings. And I'm happy to say a lot of our faculty, staff, students do that kind of work and are fully engaged in that really strong fashion. I do want to switch it up just a little bit, because I thought this was one of the most interesting questions, because at the heart of your work is a lot, and how could we not? Housing has been that great metaphor for a lot of the racial strife and other things that we've experienced in especially post-World War II American history. But this is a question. I'm a Black millennial looking to buy a house soon and thinking of where to buy. How should I think about the black butterfly and the white L when looking?
Oh, that's a great question, because what we know about real estate, and you saw it in the map that I showed you from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, we know that resources, investment, capital goes to white communities. And we know that it does not go to Black communities. So that's a question that all Black home buyers have to face. If I buy my home in a Black community, I'm facing the prospect of home devaluation, of the depression of wealth that I'm going to have. Therefore, if I want to increase my personal wealth, I need to go to a demographically whiter community where there's home appreciation. The values of homes appreciate. And it's due to the racial composition of people living in the neighborhood. There's great stories and research out that have come out lately talking about the home appraisal process and how racism is embedded in that. There's a new book by Dr. Elizabeth Corver talking about the race brokers and how realtors often engage in racial steering and, help perpetuate racial segregation in America. So, I mean, it's multi-layered, but at the end of the day, what I would say to anybody that's thinking about buying a home is that we have to advocate for racial equity so that Black butterfly neighborhoods finally finally have equitable budgets, equitable resource allocation, so that then if you buy a home in the Black Butterfly, you're going to get that school, the nice roads, the nice library. You're going to get these other public resources and infrastructure that will then help your housing value appreciate as well. Black neighborhoods and Black home owners and buyers should be able to experience the same wealth generating impact from home ownership as everybody else. The data show us that that has not been the case. So that's what we need. If we don't address that, we're always going to have this divergent real estate market that's based on racial composition and that skewers wealth generation towards white communities and skewers and inflicts wealth deprivation in Black communities. And that's the dynamic that if you're talking about crime and violence and a lot of other social pathologies in America, you can't address that without addressing that fundamental divergence in real estate and housing.
Mm-hmm. And that tracks all along, just what we were talking about before with Baltimore, the highway to nowhere, and all the other cars. I'll quote the great philosopher Chris Rock, find MLK Jr. Boulevard in any city, and you're going to see that dividing line, Cesar Chavez Boulevard in the south. But the fact that that's mapped so much into there as well, that then triggers these other ideas about what pathologies are contained or not contained. It's so well taken. Another one too that came up was about education, and we know that this is a big variable as well. This is definitely pertinent to our dean of the College of Education, Lori Mullen, who's been working on really trying to diversify the teacher workforce in the state of Maryland. And this question came from someone that registered, as there is abundant research showing that students tend to be more academically successful when they see themselves in their teachers. How do we promote education as a viable career choice for Black males?
That's a good question. Education is viable. I mean, I'm a Black educator. I'm not in the K through 12 arena. Obviously, I'm at the university level. I mean, I think that, there are probably multiple things at play. First of all, the Black teachers that you do have, many of them are being pushed out. We've seen a massive reduction. I believe the Albert Shanker Institute has a good report that talks about in multiple cities across America, this massive reduction in Black teachers. So, there are many layers to this as well, because you can recruit Black teachers all day long, but if you can't keep them, then what are you really doing? So it's not just recruitment, it's retention. It's making sure that, I think most of the Black male teachers that I understand are probably maybe involved in sports or coaching or something along those lines. So my thing is, how do we, first of all, education needs to pay well at the K through 12 level. If you're talking about attracting and recruiting people, you got to make sure that the pay is right. You got to make sure that barriers don't exist. Some of the certification as a whole, philosophically, many of the ways that certification for any field, many of the reasons why it's put in place is it's designed to weed out. Certification is often designed to weed out, and winnow the field in terms of who is able to come out of an institution with a degree or certification. I think you got to really look at that component. Are the tests and the certifications, are they culturally relevant? Are they culturally congruent? Are they culturally, across? Where are they? Do you have parity across the board? Because if you have any sort of certification, and this goes for teaching overall, not just a certification, right? If you have any test that does not speak to my culture, then it's going to be more difficult to get people from the Black community to be in that particular field. Now, that being said, we know that Black people can succeed in anything and with any test. But what I'm saying is, are there barriers in the testing process? Does it cost a lot of money? Do you have, teachers? What does the teacher workforce look like now to help, bring in more Black male teachers? So I think when you look at the whole dynamic of diversity in K through 12 education, you're talking about having to revamp and do a lot of things structurally. Again, racial equity. So it's not a conversation, hey, y'all, we want to have more Black male teachers. That ain't it. What are you going to do? And I think really getting down to the fine tooth, what is going to attract Black males to be in teaching, keep them in teaching, removing barriers, making sure that it pays well. All these things I think have to really be examined.
Right. And I think maybe the flip side to that question in some respects too, which came up as well, and I think this speaks to our entire student body, but also to faculty and staff and other practitioners going into spaces and making sure that they are competent. In other words, how do we start to ensure cultural competency? You've talked about structural and historical knowledge too, but if there's a toolkit for cultural competency, what would that impart in terms of training for teachers and other types of community engagement specialists?
I'm not so sure about that. I think what does come to mind is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I guess you're saying cultural competency. What I'm more and more aware of is that many people are throwing out these terms and they haven't completed the work of desegregation yet. Education, I went to look at the Towson University webpage, and there's a section on there where it says our history. And it has this beautiful timeline. You can go left to right and see what the institution was like. And I clicked on that and I clicked on that. And I was like, first of all, I was like, I want to use this for my website. I want to use this structure. But the second thing I said was, everybody I saw in that history was white, right? All the way up to the modern day. So that tells me something. Has Towson or any university, any institution really completed the work of desegregation? Because desegregation, before you can have diversity, you have to desegregate. If you were formerly an all-white field, an all-white institution, if that's your history, you were founded as a demographically white organization. To get to diversity, you have to actually undergo a process of desegregation. And just because you admit or allow 1 or 2 or 3 Black people or Native Americans into the institution, and their percentage of the population is like 40%, but you got like 10%, you haven't finished desegregating. You have to fully desegregate, which means reaching parity in the proportion of people in the population. Then you are at a point where you can talk and think about diversity. Otherwise, you run the risk of having tokens, and that places tremendous pressure on people of color to come in and reflect and uphold Eurocentric norms, which is another issue that we can get into. But the point is, people are talking about DEI and they haven't completed the process of desegregation. They haven't acknowledged this is our history. We were an all-white institution. What norms do we have in place? What cultures do we have in place? Do people feel comfortable when they come from other cultures into this community? Or are we still upholding things from our segregated past that function as forces that keep people away or that push people out? So I think we've lost the notion of desegregation, that it was supposed to be a process, and that desegregation is very painful for the people who are doing the desegregating. Look at the pictures of the children, Black children who were desegregating Central High down in Little Rock, how they were spat on, how they were verbally abused. When you're the one desegregating, it is painful. It is hurtful, because often that system, that culture doesn't really want you around. So I think that's the thing, is like, have you fully completed a process of desegregation? Not just as an institution, but even as a field. Many of our fields, anthropology, sociology, public health, my field, many of our fields academically were once look at our professional organizations, they were segregated. Like you have the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association. The National Medical Association was for Black physicians because they were not allowed to be members of the American Medical Association because that was for white physicians. So our fields, our academic disciplines have a history of desegregation. So I would say, let's look at your staff. Let's look at your faculty. Let's look at the administration. Have you desegregated there yet? And if the answer is no, if your faculty, your staff, your administration does not reflect the population of this metropolitan area, then you haven't finished the process of desegregation. So focus on that before you really start throwing out terms like DEI. There's a process that you have to fully complete to make DEI real. And that's what we're not, I think, focused on. Because again, I think what we do with DEI is that we value and place comfort. We want to feel comfortable. We want to have a comfortable conversation. We want to have everybody comfortable, but not addressing the real issues and the real pain and legacies and harm. And that's what we're going to have to do if we're trying to be mature and advance in this country the way we need to. It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be comfortable. It's going to be a challenge, but we can be mature and we can be real. And so I think that's the work that's before us.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And I think it kind of goes to some of these other questions too. And I think you've already addressed that. One was in the pursuit of equity in the public and private sector. Is that now the right remedy? And I think you're advocating a more comprehensive strategy that really, really critically reflects on the history and the notions of segregation and making sure that that's front and center as you're developing policy plans, what have you as well. One of the things too, though, that I thought was really just a very, very simple question, but one that's very apropos to some of the folks that I think you're talking about, those that do the hard work of desegregation, those that do the hard work of being in those uncomfortable conversations, those productive tensions, if you will. What do you do when your voice isn't being heard?
Organize. I mean, that's the thing. You can't, you're facing systems. You're facing policies, you're facing practices. And, these are all at the institutional level. So, to build power, you're going to have to organize with other people who are like-minded, who are maybe in that community to try to change some of those things. Now, the challenge is really for those administrators and the people who have power in these systems. Like, what are you doing to facilitate that systemic transformation? And one thing that I look for, because beyond race and ethnicity, you got folks who've been excluded because of gender orientation, folks that have been excluded because of disabilities. So we've had a legacy of excluding people based on one characteristic or another. Part of what has to happen is, are you listening to folks from that community about what they believe needs to happen in order to make the environment one that is warm and welcoming for them and people who are like them? So I think, are people really listening? Are there venues, opportunities to have, conversations where people can really share, hey, look, this is not working out for me. The curriculum ain't cutting it. The way y'all talking to me, I feel uncomfortable. The process to do X, Y, and Z, I'm disabled, and the way we're doing it introduces 10 more barriers for someone with my disability. Are you listening in a real, authentic way that then, hopefully informs the type of changes that need to be made, that informs the types of things that need to be done systemically to make, the university and the institution the warm and welcoming environment that it should be. So I think, that's a big part of it, really being able to listen and hear, because nobody wants to hear they're not doing a good job. Nobody likes hearing that. Even the president. The president don't want to hear, wait a minute, I'm not doing a good job. Hold up, what you mean? It's not a comfortable thing. But I think that's where we have to be mature. We have to be mature and recognize, look, there's this history, there's this legacy, and that momentum, the momentum of that history and legacy is often one that says, let's maintain the status quo. Mm-hmm. And it's uncomfortable to move away from the status quo. People love the status quo. I don't care what they tell you. People love the status quo because change involves moving budgets. And that's what a lot of people don't want to do. And that's why, that's one thing that I really look at in terms of, is it real? I look at, is there a budget behind it?
Mhm.
A real budget. Like you can't say DEI and it's unfunded. You can't say desegregation and resources aren't put into it. You can't say we're going to make this more inclusive for folks who have who experience or are dealing with disabilities, and you don't, go out, change the pathways into buildings and entryways so that people with different mobility statuses can now be able to move back and forth, just like folks who are able to walk on 2 feet. So I think that's the thing that we have to really get to, is like, put money behind where your mouth is. You got to put money behind it and make it real. Make it real. And I think that's the thing that is the challenge that's before us.
And that's why I think just the fact that we're having this conversation demonstrates the willingness of this institution to have these challenging conversations. And the formation of the Division of Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity, the fact that we have our first diversity strategic plan for the university, but always recognizing that we have to reflect on the past, look at what's happening in the present, and really try to have those conversations to chart a future course as well. So I really appreciate the huge, comprehensive, and strategic approach that you lay out in the book. I appreciate the mature conversation that you're always willing to have. And I just want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for publishing this book. And if you haven't read it, please do so. I think it's a life changer, and I think it sets a roadmap, as I was saying in the introduction, for us to really critically engage, that we know our willingness, especially at this political moment, folks want to do something. And so how do we go about doing it that's going to result in some comprehensive strategies and plans that we can follow through on, and that we can monitor, and that we can check, and everything else too. So thank you so much, Dr. Lawrence Brown, for joining us here today. And thank you for everybody that tuned in. I hope you found some value with this talk. I know you will. And the recording will be available shortly. And I want to say thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.